Hello and welcome to everyone around the world for another exclusive presentation right here on Your Contact for the very best in UFO Paranormal Talk Radio on the World Wide Web. You're locked into KGRAradio.com. It is time, as we do every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, to bring you Grant Cameron and the Cameron Files. And now, your host, Grant Cameron.
Good evening and Merry Christmas to all. This is Grant Cameron and you're listening to the Cameron Files. As always, thank you for taking some of your valuable time, especially on Christmas Day, to listen to me. Tonight I am joined by Gary Heseltine. Earlier this year I was invited to the UK by Gary to come and do his conference there, and we'll talk a little bit about his conference. And I can say quite clearly I was treated like the King of England while I was there. I was just a fantastic time. And then I went off to Denmark, and Gary made sure that I got back through the UK, put me up again, and had a wonderful time. We had a lot of discussions. We did some taping. And tonight I have him on the show again to talk some more a bit about what he's been up to. He's a pretty active guy. And just a little bit of the background, he served in the RAF police from 1983 to 1989 before spending almost a 24-year career in the British Transport Police. He was a detective, a constable for 18 years, working on all matters of inquiry, including murder, manslaughter, rape, and was an advanced police interviewer of witnesses and suspects, which is kind of a critical thing to have if you're doing the UFO field. Gary was involved in the London bombing inquiry as a special interviewer of first responding police officers. In January 2002, while serving serving police officer, he launched an unofficial national database for police officers reporting UFO sightings in the UK. He has gone on to start a UFO magazine, which we'll talk about. He runs a wonderful conference. I think it's a bi-yearly conference in the UK. And he has now just done a documentary, which I think we were going to try to spend a lot of time talking about today, which it's ready to go. And I think it's coming out in spring. We'll get to that. So good evening, Gary, and thank you for joining me on my show.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for having me on the show.
Beautiful. So let's start a bit about your background in terms of, and especially what I pointed out in the beginning, the idea of your background as an investigator and knowing how to question people and how that ties into your investigation into police officer sightings in the UK.
Well, obviously, one of the reasons why I started the police database is people say write about what you know. And when I had the idea to get involved in UFO research, I because I was a detective and you work a lot of hours on major cases, it's not one of those jobs where you can say, I'll be there every Thursday. It doesn't work like that. You work a lot of hours to try to get the crime solved, as it were. So it had to be something that fitted around my schedule. And as we talked about before, I've had two significant dreams. And the second one was to launch a police database, which was I titled Proof Force, Police Reporting UFO Sightings. It started in 2002 while I was still a serving police detective. I started with maybe 5-6 cases involving 10 police officers. And now in 2018, we're looking at over 550 cases going back to 1901, involving over 1,100 British police officers.
Wow.
So it's gone a long way, but that for the last 3 or 4 years has gone on the back burner because, as you rightly say in your introduction, I retired early from the police after nearly 24 years in 2013, purposely to create an online e-zine called UFO Truth Magazine. And that began in April of 2013. And here we are, just coming up to our 34th issue, which will be released at the end of December. It's bi-monthly, 96 pages, features articles by many of the world's leading researchers. From time to time, you've appeared in it. Steve Bassett, Richard Dolan, Susan Hansen from New Zealand, Bill Chalker from Australia, AJ Javard from Brazil, a whole host of names that you associate with the best in this field in world ufology have all appeared in the magazine, some as regular columnists, others as occasional columnists.
So you've got a pretty good grasp on who's the major researchers around in the world. Is there any sort of stories that are, say, in your upcoming magazine or in your last magazine that you could sort of point out as to the kind of stuff you're covering?
Well, in many ways, we cover absolutely everything. I'm as an editor, I'm actually pretty free with what I tell my columnists, in the sense of I only approach columnists who I respect to write for the magazine. So if you get my approval to write for the magazine, then I trust you implicitly to send me whatever, and I will publish it. And I don't think I've ever said to a contributor, no, I'm not publishing that. I've had to make one or two suggestions on one or two things, but 95% of the time, I trust everything that the people who write for me to put something down. Now, it can be range from anything old that they want to talk about, ufological or philosophical, or new research that they're doing. So it's a wide variety. And I think that with things like a broad base, you have Stanton Friedman, who's written for the last couple of years, but has now just finished his last column with issue 33, as he's taken a step into retirement now, and I wish him well in his retirement. So he's settling things down. But you've got people like Susan Hansen, who is from New Zealand, who is arguably by far New Zealand's top researcher with over 40 years of dedicated research, but she is also an experiencer. And so she often writes columns about her experiences, whether you call it abduction, contactee, experiencer. She will often relate many of her experiences in the magazine. So that shows you the broad depth. Mary Rodwell is a regular columnist. She will do the same. So it covers old, new, kind of everything. And for me, it's just a great thrill. But what does happen as an editor is that sometimes you get what I would call a moment where a light bulb goes off. For example, it's happened probably 3 or 4 times with the abduction cases. There's another guy in Britain called Dave Hodrian who runs the Birmingham UFO group. Yeah. He's arguably, well, in fact, in my opinion, Britain's top abduction researcher, having done well over a couple of hundred cases in the last 5 to 10 years. So if I get at somebody who claims to have had an abduction experience or believes that they may be an experiencer, I would refer them to him. He will organize things, hypnosis, etc. And then he reports back with articles in the magazine if the person wants to be involved in doing an article. But what you sometimes get is, as an editor, you get all the articles sent to you, which you then proofread, lay out in a magazine format, etc., etc. And then sometimes a strange thing happens that often when we talk about the experiencer side of things, they describe equipment that they've been seen or had put on them or been examined with. And sometimes they describe, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same piece of machinery. And that has happened several times when Dave Hodrin has sent me an abduction case that he's reported on, and then he's described a piece of machinery that I've then said, Suzanne, have a look at this, and she's describing also the same kind of piece of machinery. So when those events like that happened, they are for me validation moments as a former police officer, that there is, without any contact between them, these things are very real. It's a validation of that there is an interaction with with ET, with it ongoing.
Wow. And where can people get your magazine if they, or if they're interested?
It's online from the magazine website, which is www.ufotruthmagazine.co.uk. As I say, it's bi-monthly. A year subscription is probably going to be something like $17-18 for the year, and it's emailed directly to your email, so it couldn't be easier. You don't have to do anything. I just send it to you every 2 months.
Okay, we'll try to link that up in the show notes so people can go there. The other thing you do is a conference, and I spoke at your conference, and I think you've sort of changed it this year to a yearly. So go through when your next conference is and how you've been working it over the years.
Well, one of the things that I never envisaged when I began the magazine was doing conferences, because I'd no experience of doing anything like that. But within 3 or 4 months of the magazine starting in the April of 2013, a lot of people said, well, why don't you try a little conference? So the first conference was just a one day in the town where I was living at that time, which is Holmfirth. You've obviously been to that neck of the woods where I live now. Beautiful little town in West Yorkshire. And we tried that, and it was only, I didn't have a clue on how many people would attend, but we had about 100 people in what was a small room, and it couldn't have fitted more than 100 people. Since then, it's grown to a big international event, and I generally run 2 conferences a year, one in London in April, which is a one day, and then the main 2-day conference in Holmfirth in West Yorkshire in the September. So generally April and September. You've just appeared at the London conference in Watford, which is the outskirts of London. Now, we've done that for the last 3 years in London, but next year, because of my work on the upcoming Capel Green Rendlesham documentary, I've decided not to have a Watford one, because that should hopefully coincide with the time when the Capel Green movie is released. So I want to devote as much time to promoting the documentary as you can imagine. So there will not be a Watford conference in 2019. I've already explained that publicly, and it will probably return in April 2020. But next year I want to concentrate on Capel Green, because that's obviously something that's very important to me, and give it as much attention as I can.
Okay, so we'll go to the documentary in a minute. Have you got any insights as to who you might have speaking next September at your conference?
Yeah, we have got Daryl Sims is coming up. We have got Alan Godfrey, who should have appeared in 2018, but he had to pull out on ill health. Hopefully he's back. He's a former British police officer in Britain's earliest abduction case in the sense of well known. It went all over the world from 1980, coincidentally the same as Rendlesham. We've got Gabor Takali, who's from Hungary, Hungary's top UFO researcher. What I tried to do last year, and continuing the theme, we had Brian Forster and Andrew Collins, and they're ancient alien guys, and I wanted to do a bit of a crossover there, so in light of that, and it proved very popular with the audience, so Hugh Newman, who regularly appears on the Ancient Aliens TV series, and other Ancient Aliens guys, a megalith specialist, he's going to be doing a slot there. So there's generally about 7 speakers that we have, and that's what I like to do, is to have no more than 7, because I believe less is more. I've been to many conferences all around the world, and everybody takes, I guess, the best of what they think is the best from each conference. But for me, it's give people longer time, at least 75, 80 minutes. So that's good for a lecturer's point of view. Breaks every 20 minutes of 20 minutes after every lecture, so you're not having to cross your legs for 3 successive lectures, etc. And I want to give people entertainment, so I try to make it as comfortable. And so 7 for me over the 2 days is enough.
Yeah, it was a wonderful conference, the one I spoke at. And again, for people who might be interested in visiting or going to the conference, again, where would you go for the conference, the link to the conference?
All you have to do is go to the same address, the magazine website, and straight away you will see a list of pages. And one of the first two or three that comes up is the 2019 Home First Conference in West Yorkshire. We do get people travelling in all over the world now. I think the furthest we've had is from Peru, travelling in to see Brian Forster. So it reaches a lot of people. We always have international speakers, and it proves very, very popular. It's a strange thing. It's a small town, and when I began the conferences 5 years ago, I took flyers around trying to promote it, and I went in all the cafes and restaurants and said, I'm going to be starting this UFO conference in the town, and I hope it will become an annual event. And they just laughed at me and didn't take the leaflets. Now they love me because we take over the town, and we get about 250 people a day at the conferences, and we've had over 320 when we had Travis Walton over. Literally all the cafes and bars are full up, the bed and breakfast, the hotels are booked for miles around. So now it's become a part of the regular feature in the calendar of Home First, which is lovely for me, and it proves very popular because the town gets very busy.
Yeah, for people who haven't been there, it's a wonderful, beautiful little place. Sort of not a lot of traffic, and it's a well-run conference. I'd recommend people check it out if you're going to be in that area at the time, or to go there. It's well worth the effort to go. Now let's get to Rendlesham and to your new documentary, and maybe to the Rendlesham case to start with. I asked John Burroughs, I had him a couple of weeks ago. I asked him, and I'll ask you the same question. There seems to be, when I look at the Rendlesham Forest thing, there seems to be all these camps of various beliefs, of ideas, of pitted groups against each other. And I was wondering, because you've been involved in this case, you can maybe clarify how many years you've been involved in the Rendlesham Forest. Can you explain what's actually going on here, and why there appears to be various groups? Maybe it's because it's sort of like the big Roswell case, that everybody thinks, this is the ultimate case, and everybody's very serious about who's right and who's wrong. So can you go through that at first? Is that what I'm seeing? Is that true? Is there these various sort of groups that have an idea as to what is going on?
Absolutely. And what I would say on that is it's tragic for the case. There's no positive to all of this. You have a world-class case, and everybody recognizes it's a world-class case because of the amount of detail, the number of incidents that took place. But you have a very sad, in my opinion, divided position now that doesn't help the situation now, and does slightly detract away from a great case. Nevertheless, it still is a great case. But let me try to explain for you, because that's the question that you asked. The word politics shouldn't, in my opinion, come into ufology, but with Rendlesham Forest, it is riddled, for want of a better word, with politics. And you are right. You have, in effect, three different factions, which is sad. But let me draw this kind of distinction. If you can think of a top 10 world-class case, which Rendlesham is one of those top 10,
yeah.
In my opinion, it is very rare that you have witnesses who were involved in the event become its principal investigators. As a former detective looking at that, I don't think personally that is healthy for a top class case, because it means that if you become a witness investigator, in a sense, you're more likely to have your own agenda. And I think in the Rendlesham Forest case, that is, to me, very self-evident, in the sense that you have John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe with the Phenomena Radio Show, good show. But he is one faction. And then you have Colonel Holt, another faction, and his supporters.
Yeah.
I was one for 7 years. I worked with him closely for 7 years. And then you have, to a slightly lesser degree, Jim Penniston, and latterly Gary Osborne with their joint work on binary codes that allegedly emerged in 2010.
Yeah.
Now, so in a sense, you have three different factions which at one point were working more closely with each other, and certainly a degree of dialogue and no nastiness. But in the last 2 years, that has become very fragmented. John seems to have fallen out with Jim, and vice versa. And yet they wrote a book together with Nick Pope. Then I see John attacking Nick Pope and Jim, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? John has always had a problem with a lot of Holt's testimony because Holt didn't reveal things that he knew had happened that involved John, and he should have, and John was right to do that, but that's clearly antagonism towards them. And then what's happened, which was very unexpected, really, was another factor that came in, which was the, shall I say, a number of trolls, online trolls who got involved in the British side of things.
Okay.
Who then tried to say it's this way or no way. And in modern society, we live in a world where people will have disagreements all the time. If you think of Republican, Democrat in England, Labour, Tory, and you can still respect each other and disagree. And the idea is that you agree to disagree. Well, unfortunately, with the troll aspect, it is you will agree with me or else I will trash you, call you a liar, a con man, and whatever, and I will verbally abuse you and call all you the names under the sun. Well, to my mind, that is just totally unacceptable as to how you behave, and we should all try to respect each other. But it doesn't work with that. So then that camp has effectively split British ufology in two over the last 2 years, very, very detrimental to it, because of their antagonism towards anybody that didn't hold their belief. Well, I looked at the so-called evidence of what they had against Larry Warren as a former detective, and none of it stood up to scrutiny. So I rejected it. Well, because I rejected it and said, well, I actually believe Larry Warren's account and always did, and so do lots of other people. But because I did that, the magazine gets trolled now. I'm this, I'm that, very abusive, swearing. Well, I don't engage with that. I wrote a paper on it called Winter is Here. If anybody wants to email me at heseltine@hotmail.com, then I'll gladly send them an analysis of their own words about that whole troll saga. But it's been very, very nasty. It's still going on every day, mostly, towards the magazine and things like that. But I kind of ignore it. And it's only a small number of people. But these people are very vociferous and whatever, very nasty. And that's the downside, unfortunately, of social media. It allows people who otherwise wouldn't have had a voice to become keyboard warriors. But that's moving off what we were trying to say. So going back, you have different factions, and that's unhealthy. As a former detective, I think it's ideally not good that witnesses become principal investigators as a matter of case. If you think of Roswell, well, did Walter Holt become the main investigator in the public research? No, he didn't. Other researchers came in, like Don Smith, Carey, Stanton Freeman, etc., because they were investigators. And it's not the same thing to be a witness to then become an investigator. So it's what you've also got is, because these people have got set camps, and let me just give you an example. I have spoken to a lot of peripheral Rendlesham people who were there, military people, who refused to go public because they say of the shenanigans of the likes of Holt, Penistone and Burrows. Yeah? So they don't like the way the case is portrayed by Holt, Penistone and Burrows. So they don't want to get involved. And I think that is tragic in many, many ways, because as the case is now 38 years old, in a few days' time, people are going to die soon. And that sounds melodramatic, but we have to try to capture this testimony before they are gone. And people initially, inevitably will begin to pass away. So when we know that there are witnesses on the periphery who would come forward but don't, because of what they perceive is the way the case is portrayed in the media by these three principal people, then I think that's wrong. Let me give you an example. I had a 7-year working collaboration with Colonel Holt. I met him in December of 2007 for an episode of the UFO Hunters program. That's when I actively became a Rendlesham researcher. I'd done it privately, but then that was where I crossed over and then was in the TV series and have been researching Rendlesham publicly since then. So 11 years is in answer to one of your questions earlier, 11 years of research. Now, for that 7 years with Colonel Holt, it was very amicable. And initially, it was very, very good. But we fell out when he began to suddenly, well, let me put it in context. He sent me an email, because it was largely by email, because he obviously lives in the States and I live in England. But he sent me an email saying he had suddenly got a source. He didn't reveal the source, but somebody was about to, in a sense, dish the dirt on Larry Warren, who was, without shadow of a doubt, the original military whistleblower, the first person to actually put his name to the case publicly, military-wise, without a shadow of a doubt. And basically, when he said that, I said, well, that's fine, as long as you produce the evidence to back up what you're going to say. You can't just say somebody's a liar, a con man or whatever. You need to back it up. And unfortunately, he didn't. And I kind of warned him that would be unprofessional if he did that. And when he did that, and he did it a second time at a lecture, I then ended my 7-year association. We'd been working together on a screenplay that I was writing about Rendlesham Forest called 3 Days in December. I withdrew that script. So he likes to now, or certainly John Burroughs he always tells people that Holt ditched me, but it wasn't the case, and I have the emails to prove it. And that's what we fell out, because he didn't produce the evidence. I thought to repeat that without producing the evidence was unprofessional, and when he did it a second time on an integrity level, I ended it. At that time, I had no association with Larry Warren. I had no intention of working on a Larry Warren story. So for a couple of years, that the relationship with Colonel Holt ended, I think, early 2015. And basically, I didn't know his source then. I do know his source now, because it's very self-evident, and that's a lady in the UK, who I won't mention because I won't give her the airtime, because she is the leader of the trolls and has done great harm to British ufology, in my opinion, and is very abusive. So why give her the privilege of giving her a name out? But suffice to say that the way that I got involved in the new Capel Green documentary was quite bizarre. Basically, somebody, Larry Warren, had given somebody he had met in Rendlesham Forest, randomly met, and it turns out to be the director of the film, Dion Johnson. He just randomly met him in the forest whilst walking around. Well, that's pretty bizarre in itself, because Larry Warren lives in Liverpool, which is about 250 miles away from Rendlesham Forest. He very rarely ever went to the forest. He was there with a friend, just walking around, and literally there's a chance meeting in the forest with Dion, who recognised Larry Warren, had a bit of an interest in the Rendlesham Forest case, and said, "Are you Larry Warren?" And he was a bit guarded, and he said, "Yes." He says, "Well, I'm a fan of yours, blah, blah, blah." And then just from that chance meeting, he said, "Well, I'd like to make a documentary about you." Well, Dion works a lot in TV and an established professional in that field. Well, I think Larry Warren had said, "Well, you should talk to Gary Heseltine because he knows my story better than anybody else." So Dion rings me up out of the blue, tells the story, which is pretty amazing in terms of what's the odds of that chance meeting. But anyway, and I was thinking he will just be after getting funding for his TV program. So I immediately thought that this would be a TV program that would need funding. So I said, "Well, are you aware of all the current controversy surrounding Larry Warren?" And he said, "I know a bit of it." And I said, "Okay, well, if it was me to get the funding, I would ask him, Larry Warren, if he'd do a polygraph test." And I said, "Because if he passes that, then you've got, you probably get your funding because there's a story there." And he went, "Okay then." Now, polygraphs aren't used in the UK, although there are examiners in the UK, but in the police don't use them. And I didn't have any knowledge whatsoever. I couldn't even quote one because it's something I'd never dealt with. But I said, "Yeah, that would be what I would say." And because I know that Larry Warren has often said, "Yeah, I'd be more than willing at any time," and has said this consistently over the years. "I'd be prepared to do one." So anyway, a couple of weeks later, he then rings me up and says, "I've got it all arranged with Britain's top polygraph examiner, a lady called Patty Musicaro, who's based in London, and who I'd never met, never heard of." And he basically said, "Do you want to come down when we do it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'd love to get involved." And the idea was, obviously, he had was obviously didn't know what the result was going to be, but he intended to basically set up 5 remote cameras around the room, and then we would all leave the building when the test took place. And so basically that was the basis. So I went down, and whilst the camera, it's like with camera crews, they take forever to set up and everything. So I had a bit of downtime to speak to Patty, a bit of a background, etc. And I think she's done over 2,000 polygraph tests. She's an American Anglophile, married to an English guy, lives in England, in London. And basically, she's the top of her trade. She's been used by the British police, the American police. She does a lot of private work. And she wasn't getting paid. That was an interesting thing. She wasn't doing this for any money. She did it because it was a bit different, which is good. I thought, that's kind of her to do that. Anyway, cutting a long story short, one thing I will say, and I'm not going to delve too much into the real detail because that will emerge in the film. But what I would say is that in the run-up to that, obviously, while the camera people are setting up, etc., Larry Warren's milling around, I'm milling around, other people are milling around. And I said to Larry, "Are you okay?" Because I'm feeling nervous for him. And he went, "No, fine." Because if you think about it, if you were deceptive, in a sense, if you were deceptive, you would think that finally you're going to get pushed to the test here with a top test that I think is now regarded as 95 to 98% accurate. 5 different tests that they use, physical tests, that forms part of the matrix, as it were, to the question process. And he was remarkably calm, and I was more nervous than him. So that said, again, as somebody who was an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses, that I was taught to look for deceptive behaviour. And that's, as I said, having met Larry over the years many times, I never thought he was deceptive about Rendlesham Forest. And for me, that's the crux. You know, is he telling the truth about Capel Green, the scenario in the farmer's field? And again, this was very indicative that this was a guy totally confident that he would be proved right. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Suffice to say that he passed. And I assumed then that the director would then get the funding to make the TV program, because that's what most programs are made. But then he said no. He says, no, I want to make this independent. And he said, I'd like you to be the lead researcher on it, because you've obviously followed the case for a long time. And would you be the lead researcher? And I said, what do you mean by independent? He said, well, we'll be totally independent. Nobody's getting paid. Now, originally, when the documentary was being formulated, it wasn't going to be in probably more than 10, 12 interviews, blah, blah, blah. What I can say is that it has grown out of exponentially over what is now an 18-month, almost 2-year period, to over 50 interviews. I think 12 American interviews. So there's a whole host of things that were not there originally. And this has just grown and grown. And let me emphasize this, that the Capel Green documentary, whilst it will focus as a theme on what I believe through the evidence that I've uncovered, is very definitely proves that the Capel Green scenario was real, i.e. the fields, the farmer's field, the landed craft, the security police officers around a landed craft, 3 floating entities, and a meeting between senior officers, whoever that senior officer is, believed to be Colonel Williams, but it may have been another senior officer. It doesn't really matter to me that much. The point is, was there a meeting in the field? Is there evidence to support it? And my research over the last 18 months says very definitely, yes, there was. And so that's an incredible event, because if, and I say this in the knowledge that, you know, the documentary will be the release of that full information. If that scenario was indeed real, i.e. entities in the field meeting with the senior military base commander of a nuclear strike base, that would be a big story. And I would argue that absolutely my evidence says that it's true and will be revealed in the documentary. And so you've got to think, well, if that is true, would the Americans, both American military, American government, British government, want that to emerge as a truthful event rather than a fanciful tale told by some drug-induced blah, blah, blah airman who's crazy as they try to paint out Larry Warren? What if it was true? They wouldn't want that to come out. So if you actually think back, that actually, I think, provides a lot of motivation as to why Larry Warren has been subjected, in fact, for almost 36 years, since he became actively involved in 1982, when he first told the story to Betty Andreasen, or Bob and Betty Luker as they are now, and that's how it got to Larry Fawcett, and that's what triggered the release of the memo, blah, blah, blah. When you think about it, Larry Warren's been attacked all these years and painted as this guy who was kicked out, this, that, and the other. No evidence for that. But principal people have been, in a sense, been trying to destroy his credibility right from the off. And I think that, to me, makes perfect sense if his event was true, because they have no way would the Americans and the British want this to ever get out as fact, because it may be that game changer event that helps bring about disclosure that we all seek. You know, it's such a famous case. So I think that's a pretty good motivation as to why Larry Warren was singled out, and all that will emerge through the documentary. But to me, makes perfect sense as to why this little guy has literally had a very hard time for the last 36 years. It makes perfect sense. If you think about whistleblowers in general, it doesn't end well for a whistleblower. If you think of Edward Snowden, he's got to flee his country. Other whistleblowers, it doesn't end well. You usually have to pay a heavy price. And I would argue very strongly that Larry Warren has paid a very big personal price. 2 marriages, largely destroyed, each one by his involvement and the post-trauma that he suffered. And this will all be borne out in the documentary. So there are 2 strands to the documentary. There's a very strong human interest story there. And you don't have to be interested in UFOs to realize that this little guy taking on big system, which is effectively what's gone on. And little whistleblower getting trodden on all his life. That is effectively what's gone on. So I think even non-UFO people will be drawn to this human interest story that I think is easily proved and will be shown in the film. So you've got the emphasis of that story, his story, but then obviously it's incumbent upon me as the lead researcher to also tell all of the other events in that story. So we're probably looking at a 2-hour documentary when it's released, and that is a struggle to get it into 2 hours, but that's what we're aiming for. It's aimed at a release in spring, probably I think May of 2019. Originally, as I said, it would have come out earlier, but such was the way it grew out of all recognition, then there just isn't the time. And let's not forget that the people who are involved in this documentary, the film crew, are all doing this over and above their regular day jobs. There's guys who are working on Bond films who are top people in their own fields, but they're doing this not on getting paid. They're doing it because they've either had a UFO experience themselves or they're genuinely fascinated by this story. So that's good motivation to tell the truth. But from my point of view, as the lead researcher, and as I said, why would I put my reputation on the line if I've got one? Why would I put it on the line for something that I thought was a lie? Clearly, I don't think that it's a lie, but it's not based on a belief. It's based on the evidence that I've looked at and accumulated over the last 18 months. Well, if we now go back to the scenario which we talked about earlier with the principal people and camps, well, you've got John Burroughs attacking me and trying to belittle me all the time. So I don't engage with John anymore because he just tries to bully you. And that, unfortunately, is what a lot of people have described John as, a bully. And I would describe him as a bully in the way he goes. He's a good guy, he wants to get the right stuff, but I don't think he does it in the right way, and he bullies people. And that is not the way. And it's his way or no way kind of thing. I don't agree with that. We should all be working together. And it shouldn't be my camp's better than your camp. That's what's destroyed ufology and stopped international cooperation over many, many years, because we couldn't get away from the ego things. If we look at Colonel Holt now saying, oh, he ditched me because of that. But it wasn't like that. He's attacking Larry Warren but doesn't show the evidence. Then he starts to bring out the evidence in a sorts, but without showing the evidence. He's reliant on this troll from the UK who was Larry Warren's #1 fan for 9 years. Larry Warren could do no wrong in her eyes for 9 years. She used to ring up radio shows and say, get this guy on, he's brilliant, he's the best person in Rendlesham Forest. She would hound people, and then suddenly there's a 180-degree flip, and now he's almost the Antichrist. This guy, I have to destroy this guy. And there's no middle ground there. It's such a flip, which is not, in my opinion, normal, is not rational, not really based on anything. And the evidence is not. If somebody says to you, I've got handwriting analysis, as one person in that camp said to me, I said, okay, before I look at your handwriting analysis, are you a police recognised handwriting expert? And he went, no. And I said, well, no matter what you think you've got, it doesn't count for a thing in a court of law, because you're not a recognised police expert. You can't give testimony as a doctor. a medical case unless you're a doctor and have got the qualifications. So do you see what I mean? They claim to have evidence, but actually, when you know what evidence is, as I do as a detective, they haven't got evidence. So that's the kind of frustration. So you have these camps attacking Capel Green. For example, Nick Pope, who I have had for not many times, a very affable guy. We've never had a problem until Capel Green, which I find odd, because he is now big pals with Colonel Holt, and without a shadow of a doubt, Nick Pope is giving me verbal abuse now. He says I should be arrested. Why? Because I'm making Capel Green, which he says is a fraud on the UFO community. How does he know that? Is he psychic? Has he seen the evidence that I've accumulated? No. So you've got all these factions, and it shouldn't be like that, Grant. We have a world-class case. We should all be working together for a common aim. I don't abuse people. Nobody can ever say I've abused people, because I just don't do that. That's not the way I do things. I have integrity. Everybody else must look at themselves, but I don't get involved in personal abuse. But when somebody like Nick Pope, suddenly having had dinner with him and whatever, then starts saying I should be arrested, why? Just because I'm making a documentary? No, because it says to me that the Capel Green scenario, far from being a fiction, is absolutely real, and that he is a former Ministry of Defence official who I've always believed, and I've sat and had dinner with him. I've always thought he's a plant within the UFO community for 20 years. I've said that to him over dinner, and he just smiles, looks down at his feet, which says to me, body language, yes, you're absolutely right there, Gary. But anyway, why would he start attacking me and the documentary when they haven't even seen it? They're all attacking the documentary. Well, doesn't that say something to you? Why would anybody attack something that they've not even seen? And so anybody who is seen to take part in the film or to be have some part of Capel Green is being hounded by these people. You do realise Larry Warren's a fraud and all this kind of... And what is going on there? It's very nasty treatment. But all that says to me is these people have got something to hide. For everybody to condemn it without even being seen says to me that the real story is the one that we're telling. And I think that will be absolutely proved when the film comes out. And believe me, I have no desire to tell any lies. I'll just be putting more facts out there than has ever been shown. And because it's independent, there is no TV bias. There is no money TV UFO bias, no TV money bias, i.e. as to what the film ends up like. We can just tell the truth for the first time. And will some people in this film, principal people who are well known in this film, have some things to look at? Well, maybe they will, but I will only be putting out the facts as they really are and telling the people what should have happened. And I tell you, one of the things that really does emerge from all of this, and I actually want to clarify this, is because in one of the trailers, I said that it's not been fully researched until now. That was actually my mistake, in the sense of what I was saying is that in terms of the way it's been portrayed in TV by TV companies has never been investigated properly by investigative journalists until now. That's what I meant. I didn't mean the likes of Georgina Bruni, the books that have been written in the past, etc. What I was saying is that the media, because the media have not been fair to the British public, to the world public about Rendlesham Forest. There are so many interesting facts, and I mean absolute facts, that have not been given to the British public in any documentaries. And I think there's been something like 50 to 60 documentaries since the case broke in October of 1983. Now, that says to me that there's a deliberate reason by the likes of mainstream TV to water down the relevance of the Rendlesham case. And that cannot be right. So with it being independent, we can actually just give people the facts as they are and let them chew over the facts But there's no intention to lie. We're actually just going to put the facts out there. And that's my pledge to the people. So I would say you best watch the documentary before you pass judgment.
Beautiful. I'm looking forward to it. And we got about 5 minutes. So I want to get into the renewed interest in Rendlesham by TTSA, Elizondo. You hear all these stories about they recovered metal. Have you got anything you can add to that sort of news story?
Well, I'll put it this way. I watched his live lecture that he did in Rome. Roberto Panotti is a good friend of mine. He was the Italian group that put on that, who liaised. He'd contacted them and said, "You're having a conference. Can I do a lecture?" So they agreed. They didn't know what he was going to say, and I watched it on live stream, like probably many other thousands of people did. It was interesting. I thought it was a bit sloppy, his presentation, because he used a dodgy graphic about the Washington sightings from 52, which was a CGI. But he said things like, "Oh, there'll be new information coming out in 4 months' time," so that's probably 3 months' time. What that is, I don't know. I'm fascinated by the To the Stars Academy and obviously the part that the Pentagon has played. Without a shadow of a doubt, the Pentagon admissions, as they've become known, from December 16th, 2017, to anybody who has not really followed ufology, they are pretty much disclosure with a small d, in the sense that they admitted, and he had just resigned at the time, but he admitted that he had worked on that secret 5-year program. I'd headed it, working with Senator Harry Reid, $22 million, a paltry amount. But the key things that came out of that were absolutely dynamite. And the main one being that there was an admission that UFOs, UAP, whatever word you like to use, were real. And in the sense of, they admitted that exotic flying machines were flying around in the US airspace that were far technologically far superior to anything that the US possessed. Now, without saying the magic word ET, that's what they meant. But he actually said, if I say ET, it becomes classified. But what else could it be? There's definitely the UFO phenomena is complex. It's multifaceted. We now talk about multiverse, interdimensional, but there's definitely, for me, a definite ET connection, especially when you look at the experiences, the millions of people all around the world describing the same kind of beings that they're interacting with, different species, different types of equipment that have commonalities, as we spoke about earlier. So I think it's fascinating that that has happened now. I can't say too much at this stage, but the last issue of UFO Truth magazine, issue 33, on the front cover, was a number of people stood on a stage, myself included, in Moscow, which was at the launch of a new Chinese UFO disclosure initiative, which has come out the blue. And I've imparted some information to you privately on that, yes. and it's going to be very interesting. They are seeking to create a United Nations style forum. In the short term, the goal is to get 30 national representatives, UFO experts in respective countries, to join this coalition, as it were, to then try to get to go to the United Nations. You need apparently 30 separate countries to come forward to be recognized as a world authority by the UN and UNESCO. So I'm involved in that process heavily, and that's very exciting. Where it will go, I don't know, but I'm cautiously optimistic. So therefore, I see kind of two strings. It's maybe no coincidence that the Americans have come forward at the same time at this Chinese disclosure. Maybe something is going on in the background that none of us are privy to. Maybe there is a wider acceptance that something has happened that will emerge through time. I don't know. But I certainly think that after the December admissions by the Pentagon and Luis Elizondo, and with this suddenly the Chinese getting involved, that we can be cautiously optimistic and see where these two processes go.
Beautiful. Okay, so just give me your website one more time, and hopefully we can work together on this other initiative. But give me your website as we close down here.
Yeah, it's www.ufotruthmagazine.co.uk.
Beautiful, Gary. I really appreciate, and I wish you all the best on the documentary. We'll be in touch. Maybe we'll do another show when the documentary comes out.
I would love to, because then I will be able to take the gloves off and go through the evidence with you, which I can't do now for obvious reasons.
You got me excited. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to The Cameron Files with Grant Cameron. Any rebroadcast or duplication of this program or program content without express written permission from Grant Cameron himself or the KGRA DB is strictly prohibited. The Cameron Files, in direct cooperation with the internet website BeyondPresidentialUFO.com.